The gift of sex. We are to view sex as a sacred gift from God, to be used within the bonds of marriage. Here's Gene.
To understand this principle as it emerges from the Corinthian letter, again, we just have to remind ourselves of the fact that Paul wrote them a letter prior to this letter that he wrote, this First Corinthian letter. And just to review, this is what he said back in chapter 5. I wrote to you in a letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. And they wrote back with another slogan. And the slogan is in quotes. This is what they said. Now, in response to the matters you wrote about, we looked at a couple of slogans in the last principle. But here's another slogan. Quote, it is good for a man not to use a woman for sex, end quote. Those were not Paul's words. Those were the words of the Corinthians with a distorted view of sexuality. Isn't it interesting? Now they've gone to some of them to the whole other extreme. Previously, the slogans dealt with everything's permissible. Some of them are so confused, they're saying sex is off limits, even in marriage. That's how confused they were and how distorted they were in terms of sexuality and how they processed the things that Paul wrote to them about moral purity. So, here we have a very distorted view. Now, we don't know where they got this distorted view. They perhaps took something that Paul said out of context. They probably did. Maybe they took something out of Apollos' teaching, distorted it, took maybe a false teacher, came in, and that was part of their distortion because there were false teachers that were influencing these new believers. And so Paul writes back to them, and he deals with this issue in relationship to sexuality. And so he gives them a biblical perspective. He elaborates and said, here's what God says. And so we see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 2. Here's what I was talking about, in essence, he's saying. But because sexual immorality is so common, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman should have sexual relations with her own husband. In other words, this is God's plan, has been from the garden. Now, you need to understand, again, the cultural situation. If you go to Corinth or to other places in the Roman world, it was very common for a wealthy man particularly to have 3 women in his life. He had his wife. She was basically for bearing children. That's basically the only time they had sex with her, their wives. Secondly, they visited a prostitute at the local temple very regularly. And thirdly, they had a slave girl in the back room, or maybe the front room. Wife knew all about it. That was a very common practice within the Roman culture. So imagine you're a wife, you're a husband, you're a couple, and you come to Christ. And that's the kind of situation you've been living with. Well, I can understand a wife now saying, whoa, I don't like this new arrangement. I don't want to be used because I've had freedom from you. And now the other women are out of your life? Imagine what kind of problem that would create. Also, put yourself in the position of a man who's had this kind of behavior, that kind of activity sexually with other women, particularly these other 2 women. And he basically is saying, I don't even want to be intimate with you, my wife. He's learned gratification from other sources. Now read this passage and his instructions with that background, and it'll make a lot of sense. A husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise a wife to her husband. A wife does not have the right over her own body, but her husband does. In the same way, a husband does not have the right over his own body, but his wife does. A pretty simple statement at grassroots level, but very profound within this particular situation. Now, Paul goes on in verse 5. He says, "Do not deprive one another, except when you agree for a time to devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again, otherwise Satan may tempt you because of your lack of self-control." In other words, there were some of these people that were so distorted in their view of sex that they actually concluded that sex was off limits, even in marriage. They went to that extreme. And that's why Paul, in dealing with his slogan, said, that's not true. God created sexuality, but for a marriage relationship. Then Paul says, but let me clarify. Don't misinterpret what I'm talking about here. And he goes on in verse 6. I say this as a concession, not as a command. I wish that all people were as I am, but each has his own gift from God. One person has this gift, another has that. I say to the unmarried and to widows, it is good for them if they remain as I am. But if they do not have self-control, they should marry, since it is better to marry than to burn with desire. And basically, that is the norm as God created marriage, beginning with the Garden of Eden. And so Paul is simply saying, very practically, I'm not telling you you have to live the life that I live, but I am telling you here is God's will. Marriage and sexual intimacy within marriage. And that's what you Corinthians need to learn and understand in your new life in Jesus Christ. Paul was very practical in dealing with this situation. So here's the principle, really, that emerges from this passage. We're to view sex as a sacred gift from God to be used within the bonds of marriage. This is God's standard. Now, application? I'm sure you can begin to see if you think about our own cultural situation. How does Paul's instructions about marriage relationships in his letter to the Ephesians add a spiritual dimension that goes beyond the mutual responsibilities outlined in 1 Corinthians 7, 2-5? When I look at 1 Corinthians 2-5, I really basically see milk. I mean, to us, that's so obvious. If we understand the Scriptures, if we understand God's will for our lives. But they were so distorted that they couldn't understand even the most basic and simple truths about marriage. And it's almost as if Paul has to deal with the issue biologically rather than spiritually, just to give them the facts of life in terms of marriage and sexuality, but within God's overall plan. But again, I thought about that and I compared it with what Paul wrote to the Ephesians. And what Paul wrote to the Ephesians is not milk. It's solid food. When he wrote these words, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, because a husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Can you imagine Paul writing that to the Corinthians? They wouldn't have a clue. He is the Savior of the body. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives are to submit to their husbands in everything. They don't even understand what it means for the church to submit to Christ, let alone for relationships within marriage. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her to make her holy, cleansing her with the washing of water by the word. Can you imagine Paul writing that to these men in Corinth? They wouldn't have a clue. This is solid food. And basically what Paul is dealing with here in the Corinthian letter are just, it's pablum, but it's very basic and it's very important in relationship to understanding God's gift of sex. When you look at what Paul wrote to the Ephesians and you begin to think about this in terms of mutual love as Christ loved us, as a husband and wife, to be willing to die for each other. When you think of mutual submission, how to be the one who has leadership role, but at the same time to be submissive and to serve, to be a servant leader. I mean, that's heavy duty to understand that concept. You've got to understand how Jesus Christ himself came to earth and left the glories of heaven to become a humble servant, to die. That's food. That's substance. And so as you go on and you begin to understand what Paul was writing to the Ephesians, you're dealing with a very deep concept in relationship to relationships within marriage, not just sexually, but in every aspect of our relationship. Now, the Corinthians, I believe, are going to get there. But at this time, when Paul wrote to them, he said, "You were babies when I left you, and you're still babies." And let me just deal with some of the most elementary issues that you need to understand regarding marriage, and particularly sexuality.